The Omnipotent Self, a study in self-deception and self-cure by Paul Bousfield. Part 1, The Omnipotent Self. Chapter 3, The Forces Shaping Character. It will be seen from the foregoing that evolution of the individual character may be the result of a very large number of forces at work, of which many are quite unconscious, and that any considerable disturbance or variation of the unconscious factors will considerably modify the character of the individual, in spite of conscious desires in some other direction. The character of an individual is the sum of his thoughts, ideas, capacities, desires, feelings, and actions, and the general forces molding it may be briefly summarized as follows. 1. The primitive instincts inherited from his ancestors and held back in the unconscious mind. 2. Environment and education. 3. That pride in his own greatness to which we referred in the last chapter, which modifies all the other forces at work according to the direction of its development. This force will henceforth be called by the name of narcissism for a reason shortly to be explained. 2. Of the inherited instincts we have already said as much as is necessary here. It suffices for us to recognize that they are, for the most part, of a primitive erotic type, and that they are so repressed and modified as to be unrecognizable in the normal adult. When they have been ineffectually converted by environment and education, we have present the basis of many neurotic and functional conditions, and this again is a matter which is outside the scope of the present work. 3. Environment and education are extremely comprehensive terms as used in psychology. Environment does not merely refer to the home with its visible surroundings, nor does education merely refer to the scholastic side of it. Environment and education include the treatment of the child by the nurse during the first week of life. For instance, whether she leaves it alone when it cries, or whether she soothes it and rocks it to sleep again. A trivial fact, the reader will think, especially in the first week of the child's life. Yet experience shows us that this environment and education of the first week is an extremely important factor in its afterlife. The 1,000 little actions, the trivial chance words of anger or contempt, not merely of the parent, but of strangers or of other children, all make their impressions on the infantile unconscious mind. They all belong in the strictest sense to what we term its environment and education. Any stimulus, in fact, however small, which is capable of reaching the brain, forms part of this environment and education which is reacting on the child. Psychologists are now generally of the opinion that the essential elements of the individual character have all been definitely formed by the age of 5, and that, important as training in successive years may be, the environment and education during those first 5 years are more important still. It is the object of education and environment to modify and utilize the force of the primitive instincts with which the child comes into the world in the best possible way. 3 things may happen to any particular instinct. Firstly, it may remain unchanged and unrepressed, in which case the individual will be said, on reaching adult life, to be perverted in some way. Let us take as an example that instinct which exists in some animals and which urges them at the mating season to exhibit their genital organs to their fellows of the opposite sex, with the perfectly natural and proper end in view of propagating the species. We occasionally find adult human beings in whom this instinct has remained unchanged and uncontrolled, and they generally find their way sooner or later into prison. The psychological term for the offense they commit is Exhibitionism. In the small child, however, we have often seen this instinct at work, without regarding it as objectionable in any way. We have laughed at the little child who delights in running about naked, or asks us to come and see it being bathed, or on occasion calls even more obvious attention to its state of nakedness. It is quite unconscious of the primitive instinct which it is displaying, and since it is a child and cannot in any way fulfill the sexual object of the instinct, we pass the matter off without further thought. Secondly, our primitive instincts may be displaced, and the displacement must be such as to conceal them from our conscious thoughts, in order that they may be tolerated by the conscious mind. For instance, the normal adult will not be guilty of exhibiting his nakedness in the way above referred to, nor will he display desires of sexual exhibitionism in a conscious manner, but he, or more frequently she, will displace these ideas and will only call attention to the sex of her body indirectly by exhibiting the neck or arms, or more indirectly still through the medium of clothes designed to suggest, for the most part unconsciously, erotic ideas. Thirdly, a much higher state may be reached by some people in which the primitive instinct has now lost entirely its erotic meaning, instead of being merely disguised and displaced as in the last case. The force and energy of it has all gone from the personal physical plane to serve a useful social purpose of a non-sexual nature. This is known as sublimation, and instead of the desire of our exhibitionism to show himself or herself physically, the person may attain the desire by showing a fine character, by designing a fine building, achieving some high position, or anything, in fact, of an ideal or non-erotic nature. Exactly the same process takes place in the opposite of exhibitionism, which in its primitive form we term observationalism. Peeping Tom is a celebrated example of this. We have a displacement of observationalism in the fairly average young man who likes to observe all he can of the charms of every woman he comes into contact with, who takes an eager interest in her shoulders, breasts, underclothing, and any part she may exhibit. And we have the third or sublimated stage in the scientist who has turned most of his primitive sexual instinct of looking in the sexual sense into looking down the microscope or searching for the secrets of nature and delving amidst her hidden laws, instead of using the same primitive desire to look in an unsublimated and rather more infantile manner. It is exactly the same with a large number of other primitive instincts, which even did I mention them here would not be grasped or understood at all by many without very much further explanation. Suffice it to say that many of our higher activities and desires are sublimitations of lower and more primitive instincts, which we are learning to develop and control, and that education and environment have as their object the training of a child by turning the forces at work in his primitive instincts through the stage of displacement into the final one of sublimation. It should be clearly grasped that the energy lying behind our primitive instincts, whether it be repressed, displaced, or sublimated, it is a very real force, comparable with the physical energy which we are accustomed to deal with in everyday life. And this energy must find some outlet for its discharge. Thus, we know as regards physical energy that there are not several kinds of energy, but merely several manifestations of it, and that it may be changed from one form of manifestation to another, but that still the sum total of the original energy remains without addition or loss. Thus, there is a given amount of energy stored in a ton of coal. This energy can manifest itself as heat in the furnace and boiler. By means of an engine, we can change the manifestation into that of motion. Then, with a dynamo to electricity, the electricity can again change into light, or back again into heat or motion. There is one energy, but by suitable means we can turn it into different uses and give different manifestations of it. Owing, however, to the imperfection of the boiler, machinery, etc., we never transform the whole of our energy into another form. In transforming heat into electricity, there is always some heat wasted. It is not destroyed, but it remains as heat for a time and is absorbed by surrounding objects. A complete transference of energy does not take place, and the less efficient the machinery, the less is the transference. Now, evidence tends to show a considerable similarity between psychic and physical energy. In all probability, there is only one ultimate psychic energy which, like physical energy, can be directed into different channels. Thus, the energy of erotic desire can be directed to a large extent into the energy of desire for music, religion, science, or sport, or the energy of the desire for sport may be changed into the energy of the desire for mental exercise, such as chess, mathematics, or science. For example, an individual feels restless. He then desires to play tennis. The afternoon is wet. He plays chess instead. His psychic energy has been diverted from one channel into another with its accompanying excitement and satisfaction of desire, with its final feeling of fatigue and repletion. Psychic energy, like physical energy, can never be entirely diverted from one channel to another. There is always some, often a large quantity, which is not altered in character. The amount of this depends largely on the person concerned, just as the amount of physical energy changed from one form to another depends on the efficiency of the engine or machinery. This possibility of transference of energy of desire from one form to another is of the utmost importance to the psychoanalyst. By the technique of psychoanalysis, the energy of repressed desires is first freed from deleterious objectives and then transferred to legitimate ones. The energy behind the conflicts which led to alcoholism or drug taking may, under suitable conditions, be transferred to energy of higher types of desire with more suitable outlets. These processes are known as transference and sublimitation, respectively. It may be taken that every mind has a given amount of psychic energy which must find somewhere its suitable outlet in satisfying desire, whether for accomplishment or for enjoyment. We may here again take the opportunity of stating that the efficiency or lack of efficiency demonstrated in different individuals in their attempts to transfer the energy of desire from a lower to a higher channel depends not only on hereditary and constitutional circumstances, but to an extraordinary degree on the individual's environment and the actions of the parents in the first 3 or 4 years of his life. The reason why seemingly excellent parents produce sometimes execrable progeny becomes clearer under psychoanalysis. The over-strict parent produces one type of inefficient children. The parent who spoils produces other inefficient types. The nurse, the nursery, the casual visitor, the trivial conversations, the unconsidered sights and experiences all have a terrific influence in the first few years of the child's life. Parents do not realize that conventional or arbitrary methods of education, whether in one direction or another, are not going to affect the results they expect. The primitive unconscious mind of the child understands and absorbs in a manner that civilized man does not recognize. The bad father, by accident or neglect, produces an excellent child. The good father, with all his designs, may produce a bad one. This is not an attempt to show that as the child grows up, all its actions are dependent on the early environment, merely that we can never compare the good or bad in individuals. That an apparent failure, owing to its inefficiency of powers of sublimation, may yet be devoting more energy to ascent than the successful saint whose early environment made for inefficient transference of energy of desire. Some of the commonest of errors made by well-meaning parents will come to light at a later period. They teach their children to repress erotic and other desires, but they omit at the same time to assist the development of that sublimation of them which is absolutely essential. 4. We now come to the third great factor in character formation, and as this particular factor is going to occupy the major portion of this book, I will not do more here than indicate briefly the symbolic meaning of the term narcissism. The reason why this term is used in connection with our primitive feelings of pride will then gradually unfold itself. Narcissus was the son of the river god Cephasus. In his mother's eyes, he was extremely beautiful, and later in the eyes of all others, including himself. It was his wont to walk abroad in solitary places, lost in admiration of the graceful form which he thought no eyes worthy to behold save his own. On one occasion, he wanted to drink from a cool spring, and catching sight of his face in the water, for the first time in his life, at once fell in love with it, not knowing it to be his own likeness. On his knees at the edge of the pool, he stretched himself and looked down upon a face and form so entrancingly beautiful that he was ready to leap into the water beside it. "Who art thou who hath been made so fair?" cried Narcissus, and the lips of the image moved, yet there came no answer. He stretched out his hand towards it, and the beautiful form beckoned to him. But when his hand touched and broke the surface, it vanished like a dream, only to return in all its enchantment when he was content to gaze motionless, even then, again, growing dim beneath the tears of vexation he shed into the water. Repeatedly he tried to gather the lovely image in his arms, but it always eluded him. But when he entreated and implored, it imitated his gestures with unfeeling silence. Maddened by the strong allurement of his own likeness, he could not tear himself away from the mirror which ever mocked his fancy. Hour after hour, day after day, he leant over the pool's brink, crying in vain for that imaginary object of adoration. But at last, from despair, his heart ceased to throb, and he lay still among the water lilies that made his shroud. Before proceeding further and examining the development of narcissism and those factors which come to preserve it and make it forceful in our unconscious mind, we must first briefly consider the subject of determinism. End of chapter 3.